What are you calling a dog?
Yeah, making his computer up.
Are you guys all set? You guys all set?
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to call this meeting to order. It's 7:03. I'd like you all to rise, please, for the pledge to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Roll call, please.
Trustee Downey.
Here.
Trustee Bushner.
Here.
Trustee Patton.
Here.
Trustee Ryan.
Here.
Trustee Sprague. Here. And Trustee O'Neill.
Here.
Also present Attorney Gilchrist and Attorney Engel.
All right, just before we get in, I just want to talk through the format of this meeting. I just want to make sure that everyone understands that that's David Engel, who is our environmental attorney, and Andy Gilchrist, who is our village attorney. And another reminder that we audio record all of our meetings. It's a policy we started a while back, and we post those online within a sort of a normal amount of time. Now, I'm going to start off by reading through the entire resolution, after which I will ask our attorney, Mr. Engel, to speak on the matter with any comments he wants to share regarding it. Then I will open it up to the board for any questions that we may have about it, and then that will bring us to the people to be heard section, where you can ask or comment how you would like. When we do that section, as standard meeting protocol, we ask that you stand, say your full name and your address, and then that's when you sort of have your chance to speak or ask questions. So I'm not looking for a motion. I'm just going to read through the resolution authorizing acceptance of funds with full reservation of rights. Whereas, as a result of the use, discharge, release, and disposal of materials containing a perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA, other synthetic chemicals referred to as polyfluoroalkyl global compounds, PFCs, and volatile organic compounds, VOCs, by parties including Saint-Gobain Performance Plastic Corporation and Honeywell International Corporation, Incorporated. PFOA, other PFCs, and VOCs have been released into the environment in and around the vicinity of the village of Hoosick Falls. And whereas such use, discharge, release, and disposal of PFOA, other PFCs, and VOCs by Saint-Gobain Performance Plastic and or Honeywell have resulted in the presence of PFOA, PFCs, and or VOCs in soil and or groundwater in areas within and adjacent to the village of the Hoosick Falls. And whereas the village of Hoosick Falls has suffered and incurred, and will continue to suffer and incur, certain damages as a result of such PFOA, PFC, and VOC contamination. And whereas the village of Hoosick Falls, through its elected officials and retained legal counsel, have duly attempted to resolve legal issues pertaining to such PFOA, PFC, and VOC contamination, as described herein with representatives of Saint-Gobain Performance Plastics and Honeywell. And whereas such efforts by the village have not been successful in resolving all legal issues pertaining to the above described contamination in and around the village of Hoosick Falls. And whereas the village has nonetheless sought to have Saint-Gobain Performance Plastics and Honeywell pay the village for reimbursement of certain expenses and lost revenue previously incurred by the village as a result of the above described contamination, and has made demand therefore. And whereas such village demand, totaling $707,392.62, included expenses and lost revenue covering village personnel costs, fuel, electricity, and other direct expenses, engineers and certain legal services, and lost water and sewer revenue related to the above described contamination. And whereas, in response to such village demands, Saint-Gobain Performance Plastic and Honeywell have collectively agreed to pay to the village of Hoosick Falls a sum of $330,251.48 for certain expenses previously incurred by the village, including certain direct expenses and engineering costs, but specifically excluding from such payment any lost water or sewer revenue, any cost for legal services, and certain village personnel costs. And whereas such offer by Saint-Gobain Performance Plastic and Honeywell to make such payment to the village of Hoosick Falls is made with the acknowledgement by Saint-Gobain and Honeywell that the village will not provide any release to such companies for such payment, and that the village retains all rights and claims that the village may have relative to expenses and lost revenue not being reimbursed by Saint-Gobain and or Honeywell herein, and that the village retains all rights and claims for all other damages incurred by the village of Hoosick Falls with regard to the above described contamination. And whereas the Village of Hoosick Falls acknowledges that St. Gobain Performance Plastic and Honeywell likewise reserve all rights with respect to all claims by the village for expenses, lost revenue, and other damages not included in the proposed payment of the village to the Village of Hoosick Falls, as described herein. And whereas all prior village expenses and lost revenue that St. Gobain Performance Plastic and Honeywell have refused payment remain due and owing from St. Gobain Performance Plastic and Honeywell to the village, and the village retains the legal right to pursue recovery of all such prior expenses and lost revenue from St. Gobain Performance Plastic and Honeywell. And whereas the village deems St. Gobain Performance Plastic and Honeywell responsible for additional damages in excess of such prior expenses and lost revenue, and retains the legal right to pursue recovery of such additional damages from St. Gobain Performance Plastic and Honeywell. And whereas the Board of Trustees of the Village of Hoosick Falls hereby determines that it is in the overall public interest and beneficial to the welfare of the Village of Hoosick Falls to accept the offer by St. Gobain Performance Plastic and Honeywell to pay to the village the sum of $330,251.48, with the village retaining all legal rights relative to all costs, lost revenue, and other damages incurred, and to be incurred by the village with respect to the above described contamination, with neither St. Gobain Performance Plastic nor Honeywell requesting any release of any legal claims the village may have and the village not providing any such release for such payment. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the Village Board of Trustees of the Village of Hoosick Falls in special session duly convened as follows. The Board of Trustees of the Village of Hoosick Falls hereby accepts the offer of St. Gobain Performance Plastic and Honeywell to collectively pay to the Village of Hoosick Falls the sum of $330,251.48 for certain prior expenses incurred by the Village of Hoosick Falls in connection with PFOA, PFC, and VOC contamination in and around the Village of Hoosick Falls, upon the express condition that the Village of Hoosick Falls retains all legal rights against St. Gobain Performance Plastics and Honeywell relative to all costs, lost revenue, and other damages incurred and to be incurred by the Village of Hoosick Falls, which are not hereby being paid by St. Gobain Performance Plastic and Honeywell. And further, upon the express condition that the Village of Hoosick Falls is not hereby providing any release of any nature to St. Gobain Performance Plastic and Honeywell in exchange for such payment. 2. It is expressly acknowledged that the Village of Hoosick Falls, St. Gobain, and Honeywell have reserved all rights with respect to all claims for all costs, lost revenue, and other damages incurred and to be incurred by the Village of Hoosick Falls related to PFOA, PFC, and VOC contamination in and around the Village of Hoosick Falls, which are not hereby being paid by St. Gobain Performance Plastic and Honeywell, and that such payment by St. Gobain Performance Plastic and Honeywell to the Village of Hoosick Falls as described herein shall not in any way be construed as a release of any such claims by the Village of Hoosick Falls, nor a waiver, extinguishment, or a modification of any right to contest or challenge such claims by St. Gobain or Honeywell. That is the resolution in its entirety. Thank you for bearing with me as I read through that. At this point, I'd like to ask Mr. Engel if he wants to share any comments.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to give a summary of what all that means. It's a lot of legalese, and Attorney Andy Gilchrist put that resolution together, but to cut to the chase, please understand the following, and I know the board members have been over this with me. Number one, by accepting the payment, the village is waiving no claims, no causes of actions, or rights that the village has against St. Gobain. The village is not entering into a formal settlement agreement of any kind. The village is not extending a release, nor is the company getting a release for any claims the village has against St. Gobain and Honeywell. Now, look, I'm sure we're all in agreement that we prefer to get more money from the companies at this point. But everyone should understand that that would have involved the negotiation and resolution of a formal settlement agreement. And to that end, we proposed an interim settlement document to the companies. They would not seriously discuss such an approach at this point. That document, just so everyone understands, which I wrote, included broad admissions on the part of the companies and concessions as to their liability. And had the companies been willing to admit to their responsibility and to their ultimate liability here, we'd be a little bit further ahead than simply accepting the payment that they've now offered to make. But we deal with what, we're not going to make the achievable. We're not going to set that aside in the interest of the perfect. We will be back with St. Gobain and Honeywell later on. Now, I also want everyone to understand that in our efforts to obtain an interim settlement, we revealed some of the information and evidence we have against the companies, but by no means did we reveal all of it. Throughout this process, it was apparent the companies would not agree to any settlement in which admissions of fact or liability would be included. It's been apparent to us for several weeks that it will probably be likely to engage in litigation in order to ultimately compel the companies to own up to their full responsibilities here in Hoosick Falls. And those full responsibilities go beyond the question of the costs that the village has incurred. Those costs for such things as electricity, heat, personnel, lawyers, and so on. It goes to the damages that the village has incurred by having the value of its water system, the value of the hardware the village owns, the value of the aquifer compromised, and some would say beyond compromise, devastated as a result of the release of hazardous substances in the village. In contrast to where we were last year, one should understand the following. Last year, and I know the press has commented on this, ultimately the companies came up with about maybe the companies now. If you were in federal court, you'd be in big trouble.
It's kind of a tradition in the last 3 meetings. We need it now.
Last year, there was a proposed settlement before the board, and frankly before the whole village, that ultimately was somewhat in excess of $1 million. The reason the companies were willing to go to that figure last year, lest there be any misunderstanding about it, was last year they were getting virtually a full release. And the village would have been stopped from pursuing any further relief against the companies for the damage to the water system and the damage to the environment more generally. You should also recall that last year's settlement only covered costs up to the date of the settlement and would have barred any further recovery for costs thereafter. By accepting this payment right now, we are taking the bare minimum that the companies are willing to give up at this point, but we retain the right to go after them for further costs. And the village incurs costs every day. Everyone should understand that at the water plant, the building in which treatment systems are located are heated with energy that the village pays for, not the company. The electricity the village pays for. The personnel who oversee the operations of the treatment systems are village personnel. They're not company personnel. So the people who are really operating that remedial system and the party that's bearing the costs on a daily basis for operating that remedial system are village personnel in the village. And eventually the company's going to pay for that circumstance. And if it requires litigation, so be it. One further point here. The DEC consent order, which has been the subject of some considerable discussion, requires that the companies negotiate with the village to cover certain costs that the village had incurred up to the time when that consent order was executed, and for some costs following thereafter. I'll be direct about it. The language in that consent order is at best ambiguous, and I see it one way. Clearly, the company sees it another way. The bottom line is, I think it's a fair interpretation of events to say that the company is now making what they believe to be their minimum obligation under that consent order and not a penny more. We think that's an unfortunate and short-sighted approach by the companies, but so be it. One issue of particular significance that the people in the village, and here again I've discussed it with the board, but everyone should be aware of, is we raised with the companies the issue of lost water and sewer revenue. Because as I think everyone understands, water and sewer revenue dropped in the wake of the problem coming to light. To that end, the companies asked us for documentation. We provide documentation over a several-year period comparing water and sewer use and revenue generated from such use in the pre-PFOA awareness period to what happened once the PFOA problem came to light. And there was a sharp decline. And I'm not going to get into specific numbers here this evening, but we made a specific demonstration of that loss to the companies. And ultimately what they said to us was, very simply was, no, we're not paying that. That's not a cost. That's just a lost revenue. So, fine, they can take that position. In time, that issue will be sorted out. And the companies will either work that out with us in discussions, or they will work it out eventually with the assistance of the federal court. That's a bit of an overview of things, and I'll be prepared to answer any questions.
Thank you. Board, do you guys have any questions or comments before I go to the people to be heard section? I know we've been involved in this for a while. I don't really expect any, but okay. At this point, then I want to shift to the people to be heard section. Could I just get an idea of who would like to share, just by a showing of hands? 2, 3, okay. 4, okay. In that case, I'll set sort of a general limit of 5 minutes, but if it needs to go over, I don't think it's an issue. And as a reminder, please state your name and address before you'd like to start. Would you like to start?
Sure. Kathy Dawson, right down on Hoosick Street. I have really just one big question, because I really can't stand the issue of the floating bond. Does this money make that go away?
In a sense, not directly and not immediately. Possibly down the line. Right now, this is going to be a huge help in terms of cash flow that we have. We don't like the idea of holding on to a bond and holding on to more debt.
Right.
It's something we had to do to make sure that we were okay in the immediate.
So it helps cushion that?
It helps cushion the cash flow.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if it's an immediate direct yes, it will help us with that, but the idea is over time, hopefully.
Like, you know that this company makes billions of dollars a year in
Yep.
profit. I mean, I've seen their profit results. I think they can do better, but this is a great beginning.
All right. Thank you. Kevin, you go next?
Kevin Allard, 5421 State Route 7, Hoosick Falls, New York. The first thing I'd like to do is say thank you for posting that online for us and being very transparent about what you're doing. And we appreciate that very much. The next thing I'd like to do is say thank you for making this a shared decision-making process. I know I'm stealing a school word there with what we do, but that's fine to do with the school.
Steal away.
It's still great to see this being a shared decision-making process that did take place in the past. I think this is a great first step for what we're doing, but I just hope we don't lose sight of what's happening right now, and I hope somewhere we get interest on the outstanding amount, if that's at all possible. But the people in the village of Hoosick Falls are still drinking remediated water out of a Superfund site. And it's de facto remediation that the people of the village of Hoosick Falls are paying the full price for. And they need to be compensated for that. So I can see that we've got a great start and that you've got a great future moving forward. And I say, go get them. Thank you.
Thank you. Who else? You want to say something?
Yeah, yes, I do. Yvette McIntosh Sauer, 95 Classic Street.
Thank you.
I just maybe want to get a better understanding. When Honeywell and Saint-Gobain made that offer, what stipulation came with that offer? Because the resolution is what, our resolution to them or their resolution to us? I'm asking because I just need to get a better understanding.
Understand the context of the situation. The resolution is sort of the general approach we have in a meeting, but in terms of are there terms attached to this, the basic answer is no. We submitted, in the simplest form, we submitted a list of this is the expenses we've had. They looked through them all and said, we will pay you for these. There's no additional agreement or anything else tied to it.
Okay, so the resolution that we have is we're saying to Honeywell, Saint-Gobain, okay, we're going to take this money, but it's not, but you're still on the hook, and they're supposed to agree to that.
Well, let me
Yeah, certainly.
Please, I'm trying to make sure that
let me
I
explain.
fully understand.
No, these are good questions. Thank you.
It's a fair question. We've been going back and forth with the companies over the course of months. And I gave them a deadline of, well, go back, on February 8th, I wrote them a letter. And I told them, you know, look, here's the deal. I gave them a draft agreement. Shortly thereafter, I sent them a CD with documentation showing everything the village had paid. And I let them know. I said, look, you know, I want to hear from you. I think the original date I gave them was last Monday. That was last Tuesday. It was the day after President's Day. And I said, look, you know, I want to hear from you by close of business. I think it was February 20th. And, you know, if I don't hear from you or you get back to me with a negative response, you know, we're probably going to file a lawsuit here pretty shortly thereafter. And they understood that. The attorney who represents Honeywell called me on behalf of both companies sometime around 3 minutes to 5 on that day and asked if they could have 4 more days until close of business Friday. I said, fine, you can have 4 more days. At about 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon, I received a letter by email in which they proposed to pay the amount that's been stated here this evening. And that letter acknowledged that the village could accept this money without waiving any rights, without providing a release, and without giving up any claims against the company. And the company, of course, in the letter also said, look, we reserve our rights to defend those claims. And I've looked at their letter. I've looked at my letter. I've considered this fully. I've consulted with Mr. Gilchrist. There is no downside here. We are giving up nothing. We are getting money that they owe the village, and they should have paid a long time ago. And even as you and I are here this evening, the amount of money that the village is owed by the companies goes up moment by moment, because the electricity that runs that facility and the heat that keeps it warm, the village is bearing. And as Mr. Allard said, you know, in the end, the village is executing a big piece of the remedial response here, and the companies will be held responsible. They are not getting away with anything.
Okay. My next question is, can you put a price on a stigma that will be with you forever?
There are experts who can, and that sort of that idea of a stigma, I think, is something that if it ends up in court in a claim will be discussed.
Let me talk generally about those kinds of damages. This is not the first water contamination case I've worked on, and it's not the first one I've worked on for a municipality. There are people out there in America who have great expertise in assessing the damages in a situation like that. And I'm not going to get into who they are and the discussions I've had, but just be aware that I've discussed this with experts who are highly qualified, who have testified in federal court, and have expressed an interest in working with us. The issue of stigma is only part of the issue here. And I'll just touch on a couple of other issues, some of which I think Mr. Allard would probably like to hear. One of the things the company has done here, the companies have done here through their behavior, has been to externalize costs that they should have borne to properly manage their waste and their disposal of waste, and keep those costs off of the village and off of the residents of the village. It's very interesting, and I had not intended to get into this, but you know, people have right to know. 2 years ago, or nearly 2 years ago, shortly after the Department of Environmental Conservation executed their consent order with the companies, they did a survey of every identified PFOA, PFOS facility in the state of New York, and they sent out a questionnaire. And they sent a questionnaire to St. Cobain. And the questionnaire that went to St. Cobain asked a couple of questions. Have you used PFOA materials? And they answered yes for both Liberty Street and McCaffrey Street. Have you disposed of PFOA materials on the plant site? Not just used, but disposed of them, aka dumped them. The answer for both McCaffrey Street and Liberty Street was yes. And there is really no circumstance under which I can imagine during the time in which St. Cobain has owned that facility, those facilities in this town, that was lawful behavior. But that's a classic example of a company avoiding costs and causing a harm to others, and they will be held accountable, and they'll have to pay damages on account of that. By the way, finally, the question they were asked was, are you storing PFOA materials? This was in the summer of 2016. And they said no for McCaffrey Street, but they admitted they still had PFOA materials at Liberty Street as late as a year and a half ago, which of course is an interesting circumstance given their public statements in this community that they had stopped using that material a long time ago. So I know this is a roundabout discussion. We're gonna get payments from these companies, and my expectation is they will be substantial, and they will cover the damages and the costs that the village has incurred. Nobody's getting away with anything. And, I will note that the state of Minnesota brought a suit against 3M. That suit, just to give you some sense of that, dealt with contamination in an area called East Metro, outside of Minneapolis, St. Paul. It was an area with a population of about 70,000 people. Drinking water was contaminated. It was widespread contamination. 3M settled with the state last week, I think it was, for $850 million. Now, nobody anticipates those kinds of numbers here. But history is running in one way on these issues. And the cases that have gone to trial and the cases that have been litigated around the country indicate that those who have conducted business which resulted in the release of these chemicals will be held responsible.
Okay. And then my next question, I'm sorry.
Actually, can I just one quick thing on stigma?
Yeah,
Two-part. Sure. One, we have incredible legal representation, and part of solving any stigma that's there is resolving this issue. And these guys have worked. Well, and can't even express how many hours they put in, how hard they're working, and how much they know about this. Solving that half of the problem solves half of that, and the other half of it is that there's been a lot of talk of working a new water source and where we're going with that, and again, all these processes take time, but when we figure out what we're doing with that as well, I think our stigma problems are solved because we're solving two problems in the source of it, and we have people both in our legal side and at the state level that are working tirelessly to fix these problems. But I think the frustration, even knowing it's a legal process, that there's no magic wand, and if you do something too quickly, you can end up not with the result you want.
Right.
So I just kind of want to patience.
Piggyback on that. I just hope that what we're doing now with collecting this money is, as in your words, that we're not doing something too hastily, that we're not.
Correct.
I hope you hear the concern, because I know the last time we thought that settlement that was just unfair.
Right.
We were being sold cheaply.
What we're doing tonight will have no effect on any of that.
Yeah.
This is paying a bill, and we can't accept this check unless we do this formal legal process to decide, yes, we're going to accept that.
Yeah, and just as long as it does not, nothing, the boundaries, there weren't these boundaries that's hidden, and then, next year, they're saying you can't do anything because you accepted this money.
Right, nothing like that. We don't want,
I just wanted to voice my concern as a citizen that loves Hoosick Falls.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We love it too.
There was someone else.
It was myself, and I was basically Marion Stevens, Wyther Avenue, Hoosick Falls, and I was basically going to ask the same thing about the bond that you folks had signed. I think it was in December. I'm taking care of these costs to what was going to happen there, because no matter what, if we all accept any bonds or all have them, we're eventually going to be paying as all members of this community. And as the past mayor even used to say to me, "Oh, you're always concerned about the taxes." Well, yeah, I am now. I'm a senior citizen now, so of course I'm concerned about the taxes. So, like anybody is, no matter if you're a senior citizen or a regular one, but you're always concerned about those added bonds that you start having to pay extra on your income. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Real quick, John Burns, 38 River Street.
Thank you.
I applaud what's going on tonight, as opposed to what almost happened a year ago. It's a major first step, and I hope that things continue down the path that we're hearing. My concern, and I apologize if you've addressed this and I haven't been at meetings, but the stigma. Clean water source is the only way to save this village, in my opinion. I think it's dead in water. I hear all the time people coming in to look at real estate and leaving once they hear about what's going on here. We can't keep pumping this contaminated water and expect people to be bringing families here. You have to have a clean water source, and I was just wondering if there is any update, any information on that. And number two, would that be part of the settlement as far as, let's say you tapped into the Tom Hannock. I mean, the expense to bring water from there to here would be tremendous. And would that be an expense that could be part of the settlement?
Yep, I'll speak to both of those points. And first off, I'll mention that DC actually reached out to see if they even wanted us here, wanted them representatives to be here tonight. I said it's okay because we know we're at where we're at. They have been going through that alternate water supply study. They are realizing how hyper-focused we are as a community on it, because a lot of us see that as the next most important and essential step. We don't have any particular updates now. What will happen eventually is that, hopefully soon, is that they will read us into it. Then they will put that out for everyone to look at. We'll have a meeting where they will talk through that and people will have a chance to discuss things. Then I think there's a time period that goes by where people can also put on discussions and comments online. They take that back in and we'll work with those comments to further expound on things. I know there will be a couple of those meetings because some things they're going to have ready now, but some other things are going to be investigated in the springtime for more options. Whether it's the Tom Hannock, whether it's from Bennington, whether it's in groundwater source or surface water source somewhere out there, we know very much that that's a huge important point. Now, speaking to the cost of that, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but the consent order was what got that initially in motion. So if the cost is $1 million or $5 million or $20 million to do whatever ends up happening, that's not on the village.
I think with that understanding, a couple of thoughts additionally. Number one, the capital cost will certainly be on the companies if DEC orders them to develop an alternate water source. Excuse me. We have to make sure that the long-term operational costs are there as well, because hypothetically now, take the Tom Hannock, it's not a cheap run to pump water over from the Tom Hannock here. The village is slightly higher in elevation. It's a long way. So, this is a dynamic situation, and we have to interact not just with the companies, but certainly with DEC, and make sure that, to be blunt about it, they do their job properly, and they don't make any decisions that sell the village short and put more of a burden on us in terms of obtaining full and final relief from the companies.
Yeah, and I think that we all want this as fast as possible, but we also want to make sure that this isn't just a solution that's going to last a couple of years until we find out something else. We need this to be thoroughly vetted, because this is the long-term future of our water. So,
I just clarify too, and I know this comes up a lot. I know there's media here. I want to just specify, and I'm not correcting you, but you need to say our aquifer, and I just want to be clear. Yes, the aquifer is, but our filtration system does work. Our water is safe. Our water is consumable, and that's, and there are realtors, there are houses selling, but there are other people, yes, who don't understand quite that it is in the ground, but what's coming out of the taps is very good water. But we all want a priority to be the source being good too.
I understand.
So I just want, I know, but I'm more clarifying for
I understand,
the world, yes.
But we are still pumping water
Yes.
through a filter.
We are remediating for them, and I agree. But
Yeah.
I just want to also point out that it is, we're not drinking poisoned water. Our water is clean and drinkable. It's a solution in the interim until we get to the point of resolving that problem fully and completely.
Dave, if the company was to bear the cost of pumping the water from Troy, would they also bear the cost of the water bill that we would get from the city of Troy? Or would that be to be determined?
That's an interesting question. Theoretically, at the very least, they should cover whatever incremental costs would occur as a result of that changeover in source. The village should not have to bear, 1 cent worth of, of expense on account of that kind of change in source. But look, we've seen how Honeywell and the St. Gobain have acted to date, and I'm sure they're going to fight and scratch and claw at every inch along the way, and we're not going to accept an outcome where costs end up being put on the residents of Hoosick Falls. That's just wrong. So.
Yes.
Is there any particular use you have in mind for this money that's coming in now? Are there particular bills that you need to pay right away?
Immediately, it'll give us a lot more stability with cash flow, and that's something where I would simply defer to the treasurer because she knows the finances a lot better because she runs it on a day-to-day setup. But it's immediately going to go to cash flow right off the bat, and then if in a sense if we feel like we can pay something else down or something like that, then we'll do that. We're okay right now with cash flow. This is typically in our seasonal run with when tax money and sewer and water bills come in. This is kind of a low point habitually anyway, but we are lower than we normally are at this point. So this will bring sort of a lot more relief and relaxation to her, especially, I think. So, yes.
Dave Lucas, on Hoosick. If you vote for the resolution tonight, when do you get the check?
We'll be communicating.
I can answer that.
Okay, take it away.
I had that discussion with albeit via email today with the companies, and they've indicated to me that once we give them instructions, they will have the funds wired to the village within 1 week.
Anyone else?
Okay, I'm going back on the clarification of the bond because I've heard 2 different messages here. I'm concerned you're saying, okay, we're going to put this money in for the village, and I know the village said expenses. Is anything going to be cut down on this bond, or
immediately?
Because originally, when you voted on the bond, I think it was in December, it was for some of these expenses that are listed in here, and so where is this money also when they made this agreement? Are they saying it's supposed to be used for this expense?
Here's the deal. Let me explain that deal. The expenses for which they are paying the village, it's my understanding the village has already paid. And these are, but in paying those expenses, obviously that, the money to MRB, the money for all sorts of hardware, the electricity, the fuel oil, all of that. Those were expenses which, of course, the village had never really anticipated having to bear, and certainly not having to bear so long. So, this is money that's reimbursing the village for expenses borne to date. That said, please understand, they didn't cover the lost revenue.
Oh, I understand.
They didn't cover a whole bunch of other expenses, including some of the village's own personnel costs. So this is a first step, but it's not so significant. And I say this as an environmental attorney and not as someone who's in charge of the village's finances, certainly far from it. But there's a lot of work left to be done here, and you shouldn't regard this as something that's going to take care of that sort of thing in particular. We've got a long ways to go.
And I understand that. I don't think that's going to,
in terms of the bond, we don't actually have a bond payment on principal due for quite some time. I don't have an exact due date of that first payment. We have a lot of time before that comes, So we will have time to see if it's worth putting this money into that, so we don't have to pay on interest or something like that.
Sometime in
I
2019.
feel like it's in
Yeah.
2019, but I want to double
2019.
check that with
Well,
Denise.
that's, you go to your way, yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's just, like I said, we sat here, and I sat here, and you know, there's some of us here, at that meeting to approve, when you approved that bond, and we did ask the questions, were they for this, and that's what it was for,
Yep.
and so this is where I'm seeing comparisons that, and again, like I said, I'm that senior citizen that's asking, is this bond gonna come up in 219? Okay, here's my taxes going up again, and.
Well, remember, taxes are tax increase is limited right now on the tax cap, so
Yes, but I know you're also gonna have a meeting on that too.
I
that's
think
coming.
this is one of those things that being in any elected position is damned if you are, damned if you're not.
And I'm not insulting, please. I am not insulting.
Oh, no, no.
You know, I have been a
I
very
understand.
strong advocate here.
But I'm saying it's.
Thank you so much for this coming. It's like when we read about it, I can't praise it enough to say something positive. Finally, we're seeing something positive happen with this water station in Hoosick Falls. Because, yes, we will, you know, we talked about stigma. Well, this will help somewhat. But there is a stigma in Hoosick Falls. We go places, we'll say we're from Hoosick Falls. Oh, PFOA, right? And
But just to circle back to what I was starting to say was and I know nobody on this board wants to take out a bond, and at the same time, we also don't want the village to end up in a position of being bankrupt. So this responsibility for us, what I want to reiterate, it comes up a lot. We take very, very seriously. I also have a lot of faith in what our legal team is going to do, and I know that even if there's a moment where we have to start paying on those, we're going to be made whole at some point, and it's just going to take time. I hate that it takes time, but I know we're
like I said, I
working hard on
understand
that.
it takes time, and I can't praise your legal attorneys that you have here enough, because this man has given his time even for us even before he was hired, and sat there at those meetings prior. So I mean, thank you. I can't say that enough.
Yeah, I just want you to know we care about that. It's a
I'm
priority.
maybe a voice, just like I said, presumption. Because we do have a future here still.
Yep.
And we're in Hoosick, we're going to be here.
And we hear the concerns on the bond. You're not the first, second, third, fourth, fifth person to express those concerns, so we get it. Yes, Kevin.
A quick thing. You have a bond anticipation note you've taken, is that correct? You haven't done the bonding.
That's correct.
So
that's correct.
On your bond anticipation note, that's just a short-term borrowing. If you get any cash in, you could apply that towards the future bond.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, definitely can.
Thank you.
Any, yes?
I know we've addressed this in prior meetings. My excuse at work is that I have PFOA in my brain and nothing sticks. I know, it's not a good joke, but would you address again the filters and how often they're cleaned and how often they're changed?
Yes, I'll do this as quickly as possible. The GAC filtration system has two tanks. We'll call it tank A and tank B. Right now, when the water comes in, it runs through tank A, and then it runs through this portion called the midflow into tank B, and then the end is called the finished water. Based on the water usage, the amount of PFOA, they estimated the size and the amount of carbon that would be in it, so that they would have a general idea on when the schedule to change out would happen. Based on recent tests, we've seen leakage in very, very trace amounts, not of PFOA, but other PFCs at the midpoint, which means tank 1 is saturated for a couple of these trace compounds. But when it comes through tank 2 and it's tested there, it's non-detect. So DOH and DEC have already started this process of how the changeover will work. They're getting everything in place. Probably in 2 or 3 weeks, we'll be announcing this is the actual changeover, here's how it's going to work, and so on and so forth. But the quick summary is this one will come, they will pipe around it in a sense. They'll turn off the pipe so that the water comes in and goes right through filter B. This now will become the lead filter. It'll take about 2 weeks for this to be offline, changed out, back online, and tested to make sure it's good. Once this is back in, then this filter B, which is the lead, will get piped from here back into the new filter, which is called the lag, and then out to the finished water. And since it's been about a year on this first run, they'll be able to estimate that it'll approximately be another year before they have to do the exact swap. All right, any other questions? All right. In that case, I just want to thank you all for your questions, your comments. It's very glad to see some new and familiar faces here, taking an interest in our village and the details. So thank you for that. With that being said, I'd like to entertain a motion. For the resolution authorizing acceptance of funds. Brian,
Second.
Thank you. Second, Ben. Any further discussion from the board?
I would just like to take the opportunity over the past 11 months or so since the mayor started, just to thank him and the attorneys for their openness in meetings that we've had, and that I feel very comfortable where we're at right now. And I just wanted to thank both you, the mayor, Dave, and Andy for being with us the whole entire way. So appreciate that. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks go to you guys as well. All right. Any further discussion? Okay. Roll call vote, please.
Trustee Downing.
Yes.
Trustee Sprague.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Ben?
Yes.
And
Yes.
Kevin.
Put me down for a yes, too.
And you.
Yes. Thank you.
Better.
And you.
Okay. The resolution passes. I'm looking for a motion to close the special meeting.
Motion.
Ben?
Second.
Second, Karen. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.